Okay, so next thing I'll continue with is a continuation of Mexican Americans in the 1940s. These are some of the individuals I'll talk about. I won't be able to get through all of these today. Some of them will be continued the next time we meet. And so again, don't feel rushed to write all these names down. I'll go over each one of them individually. In the previous lecture, I told you about the ways in which Latinos contributed to the war effort. And so this is just a reminder that there were 500,000 Latinos that served in the US military, the majority of which were Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, and they earned a disproportionate number of Congressional Medals of Honor. All right, now I introduce you to Guy Gabaldon. Guy Gabaldon was a Mexican American from Los Angeles. And before Japanese internment, he, how do I say this? When he was in high school, he decided to move in with one of his friends, one of his high school friends, with his friend's family. This friend and his family were Japanese and Japanese Americans living in Los Angeles before World War II and before internment. And so when he lived with them, he learned to speak Japanese. When World War II breaks out, his family is put into an internment camp, and he ends up serving in the US military, in particular in the Pacific, as we're island hopping, making our way closer to until we can directly bomb Japan. So he was in the military, and basically let's see how to explain this. I mentioned that the US military would island hop. And so first there would be a bombardment of islands. So before US troops would land on an island, the US military would bomb it. The civilians living on that island and Japanese soldiers that might be there would try to hide from the bombardment. So they'd dig tunnels, they'd go into caves, they would try to hide from getting bombed. Then after that, when US troops would arrive, they would go looking for these enemy soldiers, Japanese soldiers, in particular where they were hiding from the bombing. His group that he was with, like his squad or company or whatever, when they would initially, he would go out with them, and when they would get back, instead of just resting, he would go back out by himself. He would go out and find these caves or places where Japanese soldiers and civilians who live there on that island might be hiding, and he would speak to them in Japanese and tell them, "We have you surrounded, there's come out, put down your weapons, come out with your hands up, and we're not going to shoot you, and we're not going to blow up this cave, if you come out without your weapons." And this worked. He ended up bringing in 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians. Let's see, it was 854 soldiers and 646 civilians. This gave Guy Gabaldon the record by far of being the individual US soldier to have brought in the largest number of prisoners of war, enemy combatants. So he was recommended for a Medal of Honor, but he wasn't given a Medal of Honor. He was given a Silver Star in 1944. Then in 1960, they made a movie about him called Hell to Eternity. When the movie came out and the public learned about Guy Gabaldon, then the Navy decided to upgrade his medal from the Silver Star to the Navy Cross in 1960. And let's see, this is the actual Guy Gabaldon in 1960. This is the actor who played him in the film. Now, in the film, they never said that he was Mexican American, so the general public didn't know that. So yeah, that's a long trailer for the film, and I just find it interesting that even back then they were already kind of promoting war movies by saying this one is the most real, this one is the most accurate, this is a true story, which is, you know, the same way that those films are promoted today. So he was upgraded to Navy Cross. He never did get the Medal of Honor. There were people that were advocating for him to get the Medal of Honor. And that's what this other mini documentary is, or short documentary is about trying to get attention to him so that he would get the Medal of Honor.
The guy called Gabaldon was Benjamin. Those other men, Guy is an American of Spanish descent, whose ancestor was a conquistador in New Mexico 5 centuries ago. It's been over 60 years since a 17-year-old kid from East LA hit the beach in the Central Pacific. He slowed down a little, and the words and memories aren't as quick off the tongue, but the dynamism of 1944 is still a living gateway to another time. That was all around him.
But yeah, unfortunately, you know, the advocating for him did not succeed, despite them making that documentary. And yeah, this is what the Silver Star looks like, the Navy Cross, and the Medal of Honor. Oh, by the way, there was a Anglo-American named Alvin York, who was given the Medal of Honor for capturing enemy soldiers. He captured 132 and got the Medal of Honor. Gabaldon captured 854 and did not get the Medal of Honor, plus all the civilians as well. Next person I introduce you to is Ralph Lazo, another Mexican American from Los Angeles, who was also in high school when the war began. Also was super close to a Japanese friend and family. And so when his friend and his family were sent to the internment camps, he told his parents that he was going to go to camp, and then left with his Japanese friend and their family with the Japanese and Japanese Americans that were put into camps. And so in 1942, he joined them and ended up at Manzanar internment camp. And so here he is with the other Japanese young men at the camp. And the authorities never figured out that he wasn't Japanese. They weren't checking. I guess they just figured no one would volunteer to go there if they weren't. And they didn't find out until 1944 when he was drafted. And so then he served in the military, but that's when it became public that he had been at the Manzanar camp with the Japanese and Japanese Americans. He ended up serving in the Pacific. He ended up getting a Bronze Star. And there's this short film called Stand Up for Justice about Ralph Lazo. And I'll play you a little clip of that.
Explained how anger had overwhelmed him as he watched all the friends he grew up with and their families be forced out of their homes. He said it was wrong and I couldn't accept it. So when one of Ralph's friends suggested he come along and show his support, Ralph didn't hesitate. He went home and told his dad he was going to camp. Then he went to the Santa Fe train station in downtown LA and got on the first train headed for the Manzanar concentration camp. His dad, of course, didn't know Ralph meant a concentration camp when he said camp. But by the time he found out, Ralph had already been there for months. Because of his skin color, no government official at the camp ever asked Ralph about his ancestry, or if he was even Japanese. Ralph was later quoted as saying, "Being brown has its advantages." But it wasn't hard for his fellow camp inmates to see that Ralph Lazo was Mexican-American and not Japanese, mainly because he didn't look Japanese. But everyone liked Ralph, so no one said a thing. Ralph lived at Camp Manzanar for 2 years, where everyone slept on straw-filled mattresses in overcrowded living quarters that were surrounded by barbed wire, armed guards. Ralph did his best to keep everyone's spirits up. Ralph and his friends did end up graduating together in 1944 from Manzanar High School, a school created inside the camp. In August of 1944, government officials finally realized that Ralph Lazo was not Japanese when he was drafted into the army. He was 19. Ralph was taken from the camp and sent to the military, where he served from 1944 to 1946 and was awarded a Bronze Star for heroism in combat. Manzanar continued operations for another year after Ralph left, allowing the last of the incarcerated to leave the camp in November 1945.
All right. Next person and organization I'll introduce you to is Hector Garcia, who was the founder of the American GI Forum. This was an organization that focused on fighting for equal treatment of Latino veterans. And there was one incident that got him started. The first veteran that he advocated for was Felix Longoria. The story of Felix Longoria is that Felix Longoria was a Mexican-American from Texas who was killed during World War II. His body was brought back home to his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas. But the funeral home refused to hold a wake for him at the only funeral home in his hometown of Three Rivers, Texas. And the funeral home said explicitly that it was because the white people of Three Rivers, Texas would not like it if they held a wake for a Mexican-American person there. So Hector Garcia tried to advocate for him to be buried there, to hold his wake and be buried there. They did not honor that. So Hector Garcia ended up getting Felix Longoria buried at Arlington National Cemetery I think it's in DC or in Maryland, where you know, to be recognized and be properly buried. Let's see, there might be another short clip here.
In small places. They are racist, and they will be racist until they die. And spark the powerful Mexican American civil rights movement. Now the town was trying to defend the past.
It's not to through a scam, but to heal.
The Longoria.
So yeah, the Longoria Fair is a PBS documentary about that. Whoops. All right, later on, we're gonna be talking about Cesar Chavez, not so much today, but just introducing him now since we've been talking about World War II and Pachucos. Cesar Chavez eventually ends up becoming the most well-known Mexican-American civil rights leader in the 1960s. But before he became a labor leader, he was just, you know, just a Mexican-American teenager, youth, in Central California. And he participated in Pachuco culture. And, you know, I just think it's helpful again to see Pachucos. You know, a lot of Pachuco, maybe even the majority, you know, Pachucos ended up going on to serve in the military. They ended up, you know, going on to become productive members of society, not just the juvenile delinquents that they were portrayed as in the 40s that helped inspire the Zoot Suit riots. And so, yeah, he's, I think, here and here. He goes on to serve in the Navy. And then when he gets out of the Navy, he goes back to Central California. He starts working for the Community Service Organization, the CSO. The CSO ends up becoming California's most important association for Mexican Americans during the 1940s and 50s. And so Cesar Chavez gets his training there, and we'll talk more about him when we talk about the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement or the Chicano movement. But again, this was the most important association for Mexican Americans in the 40s and 50s. And so when I talk about the next person, they're important to that person as well. Edward Roybal. Edward Roybal ran for Los Angeles City Council in 1947, but did not succeed. So then the CSO focused on Los Angeles. They registered 12,000 voters. Other issues they cared about was housing discrimination and police brutality. And so, you know, since the 1940s and earlier, even before that, minority communities have been complaining about their treatment by police authorities. So it's not something new. So he did not succeed, but then the CSO registered more voters, so that when he ran again 2 years later in 1949, he did win and got in the city council. This made him the first person of Mexican descent to be in the city council since 1881. And he won with the support of not only Mexican Americans, but also African Americans, Jewish Americans, and labor activists. One of the things that he focused on was the issue of gerrymandering. Politicians refer to that as just redistricting. I'll play you another short video about explaining how gerrymandering works.
Giving more democracy to our citizens by adding a legislative branch to the government. The citizens each get one vote and are divided into ranges. Each range will elect one representative to send to the newly created Jungle Council. To best understand how the system works, let's take a look at a small colony where there are just two political parties, the Buffalo and Jackalope. This colony is divided into 4 ranges. In the first election, Jackalope candidates win 2 of them, and Buffalo candidates win the rest. All is well for several election cycles until the Animal Kingdom census taker comes around and shows that the population has both moved and grown. To better represent the larger population, a new seat is added to the Jungle Council, so the range's boundaries must be redrawn. This is where the trouble begins. Redrawing electoral boundaries is a huge political problem. To help them, the representatives of the Jungle Council hire a Weasley consultant to figure out where the new boundaries should go. If Weasel draws rectangular boundaries, everything will be okay because the Jungle Council will, as close as possible, reflect how the citizens vote. However, Weasel doesn't do this. Instead, he tells the Buffalo Party that, for a price, he can turn their slim majority into a landslide victory in the election. With a supermajority on the Jungle Council, the Buffalo wouldn't have to listen to those pesky Jackalope filibusters anymore, so the Buffalo gladly pay up. How can Weasel deliver on his promise? It's depressingly simple. By packing together as many Jackalope voters into one range as possible and spreading the rest of them out, the Buffalo Party can win an additional seat without any voters switching allegiance. What Weasel and the Buffalo have done is called gerrymandering, the intentional changing of electoral boundaries for their benefit. Several election cycles later, the underrepresented and disgruntled Jackalope Party approaches Weasel and asks if he can manipulate the ranges to be in their favor instead of in the Buffalo's. Why, indeed he can. Using the same trick, Weasel packs Buffalo voters into a few ranges and spreads the rest among the Jackalope supporters. After the election, the Jackalopes, who represent a minority of voters, are now, nonetheless, the majority party on the Jungle Council. This is the terrible power of gerrymandering. Weasel can take the exact same voters and get either party to win the election. Unsurprisingly,
That's an introduction to gerrymandering. One of the issues that Edward Roybal focused on and worked on. And by the way, so this gerrymandering could be done for political, for the purposes of political parties, but historically it's also been used to disempower minority communities like African Americans or Mexican Americans, for example. And by the way, Wisconsin is, unfortunately, Edward Roybal didn't prevent gerrymandering for all future in time. Wisconsin was found by a federal court in 2010 to have been gerrymandered, and they weren't able to make any changes to the gerrymandered districts until just 2024. And so it's very recent that they undid some of that gerrymandering. So he becomes the most important voice for Mexican Americans, especially in the 1950s, but from right before the 50s to right after. Then he goes on to the House of Representatives in Congress from the 60s to the 90s. And he also helps found a lot of important organizations. He was founder of an organization called MAPA, the Mexican American Political Association, NALEO, the National Association for Latino Elected Officials, and LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens. Now, it's also important to note that he is representative of the Mexican American generation. And I don't know if I've talked about generations before, but I'll make a note to do that. Or I'll do it a little bit now. In the 1920s, we had the Mexican generation. This is when people from Mexico became the majority in ethnic Mexican communities and were the leaders of those communities. And so they did a lot of things like record music in Spanish, open the first Spanish language newspapers of those communities, create Spanish language radio stations and so forth. The Mexican American generation was all about assimilating, believing in education, believing in the electoral process, organizing citizens. They weren't very concerned with undocumented immigrants. They were focused on U.S. citizens. Mexican Americans, being citizens, getting an education, voting, essentially, kind of assimilating, becoming mainstream US citizens. And the similar thing that Edward Roybal was going through, other people in other parts of the Southwest were doing similar things, like Henry Gonzalez in San Antonio, Texas, or Raymond Telles in El Paso, Texas, also becoming important Mexican-American politicians for those areas.